Martin. Well, first, I am Stephen Friedfeld, the co-founder of AcceptU, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now I'll introduce Paul Martin. Paul is the founder of College Money Method. College Money Method is one of AcceptU's partners, and he has served as a fantastic resource for our students and their parents with regard to planning the financial aid process as well as applying for financial aid, and we'll discuss that tonight. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A chat box. Paul's going to make sure he gets through the entire presentation first, and then we'll jump into Q&A. We're going to try and have everything wrapped up in about 1 hour so that we're mindful of your time. And behind the scenes, I can always answer questions while Paul is presenting, just so that we can try and troubleshoot any AV and technical difficulties. Paul, I'll let you take it away. Thank you again so much for chatting with everyone tonight. I really appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for having me here. It's really a passion area of mine to make sure that people get information they need about affording college and paying for college. So this is a great opportunity, and thank you to all the families who've shown up tonight for this information. Just wanted to quickly go through what key answers we're gonna give you today to these questions, and which is basically, how does financial aid work? And I'm gonna do a very brief overview of this just to make sure we're all on the same page. I know many of you have done a lot of research about financial aid, so I don't spend a lot of time here, but just to have a starting point for us, we're really gonna spend time tonight talking about what are the process and timelines involved with financial aid, so that you make sure you're clear on different deadlines, on different qualifications. And then I really get into what you should be expecting for the financial aid applications. I know that a lot of the families I work with individually and in a lot of workshops, there's a little bit of anxiety around financial aid applications because there are a lot of questions, and clearly they get into your personal financial life. So families really want to make sure that they understand what needs to be reported, what does not need to be reported, which is an important point, and do it accurately so that they're maximizing their opportunity for financial aid. And then finally, we'll talk about a couple strategies for success along the way so that you could be more successful with your applications and potentially boost your financial aid eligibility. And then hopefully we can get through this much under an hour so I can take Q&A and questions, because every family situation is a little different. That's why I work with individual families to really understand the complexity of how their financial life works and how to best position themselves for financial aid. So just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Paul Martin. I'm actually first in my family to go to college, and I had the fortune to go to Harvard and then get my master's from MIT. And I founded College Money Method because I know that financial aid and just an overall planning financially for college is critical for so many families and most importantly the students to achieve their college dream. As part of that, I'm a member of the National College Advocacy Group, and we really work, we're fellow financial advisors that work on really advocating for college accessibility and affordability. I'm currently earning my certified financial planning degree from Northwestern. And you can see there I'm president and involved in my alumni association at Harvard as well as at MIT. So that's a little bit of background on me. Really, let's get into the meat of what we wanted to talk about today. So the first thing I wanted to do is just really give you an overview of today's cost of attendance, because when you're thinking about budgeting for college and what kind of financial aid you might need, you really have to take into account all of the expenses on an annual basis that go into paying for college. And how we make this real is by giving you a couple examples of universities out west, right? So you can see here the differences in tuition are quite wide when it comes to an in-state California resident for USC, UCLA, and University of Washington. But what's important is not just to focus on those tuition and fees, but what is that total cost of attendance? And when you're looking at a school like UCLA, those additional costs are actually more than tuition. So making sure that you're budgeting on both tuition and non-tuition costs is really important. And the reason why I bring this up explicitly is because this is how your financial need is assessed. It's not based on if you could afford tuition, it's based on whether you can afford the total cost of attendance. So what makes up financial aid? Well, it's all the money to help you bridge the gap between what you could afford today and the cost of attendance. So most people think of this green shaded area, which are the grants and scholarships, because that's free money, right? And that's the money we're most excited about because it doesn't have to get paid back. But invariably, financial aid will involve what they typically call self-help, which will be loans and work study, and that will be part of your financial aid award in most cases. And in that process, it's important just to understand that there's going to be a balance there. Now, how is financial aid determined? What are the two building blocks? So this is what we're going to get into tonight, which is on the left side, which are the applications. You have FAFSA and you have the CSS profile offered by the College Board. There are two financial aid applications for many colleges. Most colleges only require FAFSA, which is the one. But what both these applications do is they determine your expected family contribution. That's their idea of your ability to pay, how much you should be able to pay. And based on that, you'll understand what your financial need is, because it'll be whatever's left over given that cost of attendance. And I'll show you those examples. Now, what's also important is to put together the college's financial aid policy. Are they giving out financial aid based on need, which means that your expected family contribution needs to be lower than the cost of attendance, or are there merit opportunities? And even when there are merit opportunities, it's important to remember most colleges and many colleges will require you to do financial aid applications. So a lot of families come to me and they say, well, I don't think I'm going to qualify for need-based aid. Why do I have to fill out applications? And we have to go through their college list and make sure we're detailing that there may be colleges on their list that are merit targets for merit aid and scholarships, but that will require financial aid application nonetheless. So going back to how do you figure out your needs? So this is an example. If we take back that total cost of attendance from those 3 universities we're talking about on the West Coast, we apply for financial aid using FAFSA or CSS profile, you will understand what your expected family contribution is. So in this case, in the hypothetical, this family's expected family contribution is about $35,000. Well, what we can see here is, depending on the school, all these schools could be on your child's list. Your financial need or the financial aid that you may receive from financial need perspective can be very different. At USC, your financial aid is higher than the expected family contribution, whereas clearly in the in-state university like UCLA, you're not going to get financial aid from a financial need point of view. And University of Washington is somewhere in between. So this is why it's important. This is a very fundamental equation, if we have to do any math tonight, to understanding your eligibility for need-based financial aid. Because once you understand what your expected family contribution is, and you look at the cost of attendance across all your colleges, you're going to be able to determine which colleges you will have financial need for and which colleges you will not have financial need for. But remember, as mentioned, even at a UCLA, if there are merit opportunities, you may have to apply through FAFSA at minimum in order to access those merit opportunities. So it's important to keep that in mind. So let's get down to the heart of the matter, as they say tonight. How do you actually apply for financial aid? So there are 2 applications. The first one is FAFSA, which is called the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And it's a free application, as you would say in the title, administered by the Department of Education, and it's required by all colleges. So even if your college will require the CSS profile, which is a fee application by the College Board, there are about 150 colleges that will require it, you still will be submitting FAFSA as well. So FAFSA is the fundamental application. CSS profile could be a supplemental application depending on the college. Both applications determine your EFC, but there are different rules, if you want to, different formulas in which they will determine that. FAFSA is called the federal methodology, and CSS profile is called the institutional methodology. And very importantly, FAFSA unlocks access to any federal student aid programs. So any aid that you might be receiving from the federal government, including student federal loans, FAFSA is required for. So again, in the case that, well, let's talk through loans first before I get there. Now, CSS profile, really, each college will customize their ESA formula to award their institutional aid, the awards from the colleges themselves. So I was getting a little excited, getting ahead of myself. But let's talk about the different types of federal aid that FAFSA unlocks. The first one are free money, which are grants. And the most famous one, or the most ubiquitous one, is the Pell Grant. It is based on your EFC calculation, and the maximum award you can get is for this coming year, not for the year your students will apply, but for this academic year, the maximum award is $6,495. Clearly, that doesn't cover anywhere near the full cost of attendance, even any full tuition at most universities. So the reality is that this is a starter grant for a lot of people. There are other grant opportunities. I put them down there, but they're even much less much less common than the Pell Grant. The important, for most families, federal aid assistance that FAFSA unlocks are federal student loans. And these are called direct federal student loans. The current interest rate is very competitive at 3.73%. And there are borrowing limits per year depending on which year your student is in college. And there are two types, subsidized and unsubsidized loans. The difference between those two is if your student receives a subsidized loan, the federal government will pay the interest accrual during that deferment period, because all of these student loans will be deferred until 6 months after graduation, or if the student happens to drop below halftime. The other type of loan that FAFSA will unlock are federal parent plus loans. And that has an interest rate of 6.28%. And there are borrowing limits that are different depending on your financial need. Importantly, between these two loans, and this is my last little note on this, is student loans require no credit history whatsoever. So students have access to these loans without having a credit history, whereas parents applying for Parent Plus loans do have to show credit worthiness in that process. So these are the primary federal aid programs that FAFSA will unlock for you. Now let's talk about the process and how you understand the financial aid process, since there are two applications. So in both application worlds, parent and student income and assets have to be entered. These are two separate systems, again, two separate applications. As we discussed, FAFSA will determine your eligibility for federal student aid. It will calculate your federal EFC, and then it passes that information and the financial information you're entering along to colleges where you're applying for financial aid that you designate. And it's important to know that FAFSA doesn't determine your financial aid package. It only determines if you're qualified for any federal aid. Now, College Board CSS profile collects your financial data and simply passes it to the colleges that are participating with College Board. So again, why I say this and emphasize is these two applications don't give you a financial aid package. They're just collecting data to send to college financial aid offices. Then what do the college financial aid offices do? All colleges will use eligible federal student aid, right? Because that's money that the government's giving students. Colleges will package into their college award letter. FAFSA only colleges that only use the FAFSA, will use the FAFSA data and the federal expected family contribution to then award their additional institutional aid, whereas profile colleges will not use that information from FAFSA, but instead use a profile data in order to calculate their EFC and their institutional aid. So that's an important distinction, but the reason why every college requires FAFSA is that first line item, right? Is that every college will use eligible federal student aid to package into their financial aid award. Now, let's talk about getting started. So what do you need to do to apply for these applications? So for FAFSA, you actually have to create a federal student aid ID, or FSA ID, you'll hear it called. Only one of the, if it's a married couple, only one of the parents needs to create an ID, and then the students need to create an ID. And you can find this pretty simply by Googling FSA ID login or account creation. Once those IDs are created, both the parent and the student will use their own ID to complete their respective sections, because there's a section on parent finances and there's a section on student information and student finances. However, for the College Board CSS profile, you'll use the same login that your student has been using to check their SAT scores, their AP scores. If they're deciding to go test optional, they might have to create a College Board login, but there is no separate parent login, with the exception of the situation where a non-custodial parent might have to submit information, which I'll talk about. But essentially you share the same login and enter that information. And what you'll need to complete these forms, and we'll go to a lot more detail about this, is you're going to use your 2020 federal tax returns. So that was last year's tax returns, your account balances of savings investments at the date of filing, and you should be printing out your statements for a reason I'll mention shortly, and then additional financial aid information that specific applications might require. And we'll talk about what some of those are. Sorry, financial information. I said financial aid. Now, what are the dates and deadlines? So the great thing is you're at a webinar now. It's still early September. And the reality is you can't even apply for financial aid for next year, for fall 2022, until October 1st. You might be aware of that. The applications have not opened yet. And both applications open on the same day, which is October 1st. Now, the application deadline will be dependent on your admission cycle. Typically, if your student is applying ED or EA, you would be expected to have your financial aid application in by that same deadline for admission, and similarly for regular decision. However, if you go to every college's financial aid website, they will have very clear dates on when they expect would be the timing that you would have your financial aid application in by. Now, some of the dates are cutoffs. In other words, they won't consider applications afterward. Some of the dates are suggested in order to be awarded the most aid, because if you do happen to apply afterward or later, the reality is that colleges have a set amount of money, and they might have already awarded the first bank of students money, so there's less money for your student. So it's important to get your applications in by the deadline. So we talked a little bit about printing out statements. There's a reason for this, because there are two different types of reasons why you might need your financial documents. FAFSA may require verification. So FAFSA will verify certain number of financial aid applications a year. And please remember that the financial aid application, when you sign that, you're signing that under federal law, and there are penalties if there's information that's misreported or things that are missing. So it's important that you fill that out completely and that you have the documents to verify what you filled out. On the flip side, most CSS profile schools will require document submission. It's not a verification, it's just an additional level of scrutiny that they want to put forward, and they will automatically send you an email asking you to submit additional documents. And this is pretty much on a regular basis. Certain colleges always will require a tax return or a statement from your savings or what have you. So be aware of that. And then of course, award letters, really, those dates really vary by college and by when you're applying and when you're admission. But what I want all families to remember is that you'll apply for financial aid every year. So once you get into your dream school, and you're sending your kid off to college in September, October 1st, you're going to be applying for financial aid for sophomore year. So this is an annual process, something to get comfortable with. Now, let's talk a little bit about status. And when I say status, of course, it's like your different statuses you need, or eligibility statuses might be better stated. So as for citizenship status, one thing is important to note is this is for FAFSA, only the student is required to have US citizenship or a related status. So student, if the parents are not US citizens or have an alternate status, the student can still apply for federal student aid, because the applicant is considered the student, not the parent, even though parents submit information. Now, of course, importantly, there are a lot of CSS profile schools, or that the reason why CSS profile exists in part, that award international students aid. So invariably, you'd have to check with the individual school whether they have international financial aid awards and whether they use the CSS profile to collect that information from international students. As for dependency status, I get this question a lot from parents. Your student is considered a dependent unless they have very specific criteria, of which most students in their freshman year do not qualify, which is that you have to be older than 24, be married, or have dependents, basically children themselves, or be in the military or a veteran. So invariably, every student is going to apply as a dependent, but I can field questions on that. And then custody status is also important. So if it is a situation where there's a divorce or there's a single parent, the question becomes, who did the student live with for greater than 50% of the days during the 365 days prior to application date? And that's almost a tongue twister. So it's the year leading up. If you apply on October 10th of this year, those 365 days prior, you have to add up those days and figure out who the student has lived most of the time with. Now, for most cases, that's not a big deal, but when there's joint custody and a lot of sharing of students' custody, that's an important distinction. Why is that an important distinction? Is because FAFSA will only require reporting financial information from the custodial parent. So the non-custodial parent's finances are completely ignored on the FAFSA application, whereas for CSS profile, about 76% or 113 out of the 150 colleges also require the non-custodial parent, even if they're remarried and have other kids, to report their financial data for completion of the financial aid application. And I work with a lot of families. I'm actually going to have a workshop on this I'll talk about later, particularly for single and divorced parents, on how to navigate this, because this can be a little tricky, and there are ways to appeal this, but that, there are a lot of rules around that. So wanted to make that clear. So who are these CSS profile schools? So this is just a partial list of the school, and this is not something you have to memorize. There's a website you've probably already been to see which schools are there. But the reason why I bring this up is because invariably, most students' college lists have at least one college that's a CSS profile school. And once there's one college, that means that application does have to be completed, unless the college is, of course, eliminated from the list. But usually it's more than one college. Usually it's half the list. Sometimes it's the entire list. These are the schools, and you can actually go, if you Google school list CSS profile, it will take you to the CSS profile page that lists the programs, and you could filter by whether a domestic student's required to submit it for these schools, when international students are required, and importantly, if the non-custodial parent's information is required. So this is a great resource for you to start to do your research, because one of the key takeaways from tonight is build out, just like you built out your list for applications and application deadlines for admissions, you need to be doing the same for financial aid and financial aid deadlines, and which applications need to be submitted for those deadlines. So let's go a little bit into now, since we've gone over a review of the process, how is EFC calculated? So we've talked about this concept of these applications come up with an ability to pay, which is called expected family contribution, or EFC. Well, there are 4 key components that go into calculating EFC. And I'm taking this from your class, hope these are all seniors, the class of 22 perspective. So remember, you're using your income from 2020 tax returns, and there's a percentage of the parent income that's considered available to contribute to contribute to college, and a percentage of the parent's assets, and all of those account values are on the data filing in 2021. And similarly, there's a percentage of student income and student assets. Those are all added together to come up with expected family contribution. So there's a lot of rules around this. I've done a previous presentation this spring for junior families and senior families on what are the rules and how is EFC calculated. I know these rules in and out, in the formulas, and this is kind of how I work individually with families to help them understand what parts of their financial picture are impacting their EFC, and if there are opportunities for them to lower the EFC based on how their financial picture looks. So I can't go into those details tonight because I wanted to really focus on what's required in the applications, but this is the starting point. Now, importantly, if you just want to know your overall EFC, you could find that out later by going to the College Board and using their EFC calculator, putting your financial information in, and it will give you an estimated EFC based on the information you provide for both the federal and institutional methodology. So we talked about having to report income. So what is the income that needs to be reported? So basically, both the FAFSA and CSS profile capture all the tax income in your adjusted gross income. So these are what you think of, and I think a lot of people think of, oh, my income is my wages, right? You know, my salary. But in fact, they add in, just like AGI does, earnings from investments. So if you have really high capital gains because we've had a great stock market, or if you happen to be invested in a lot of stocks with dividends, all of that income for 2020 will be counted as part of the income that could be available for contribution. Of course, earning from profits of businesses you have, whether it's Schedule C or a K1, all of these profits are part of your AGI and therefore part of the income that's counted. Retirement distributions and Social Security benefits as well. And then in the unfortunate case that somebody was on unemployment benefits that were taxed, of course, are part of the AGI. So, you know, again, I think when people think income, they tend to think of just their salary, but there are all these other incomes that are taxed that will also be considered income in the financial aid application process. Now, I wish that were the end of the income story, but the reality is that there are a lot of untaxed income items that are added back that you need to report on the applications. And I put here which applications require this and an X where FAFSA does not require this income information. So surprisingly, anything you've contributed pre-tax to your retirement accounts, whether it's 401k or IRA, you need to account for that and report that on FAFSA or CSS profile as income that, you know, they're gonna look at. Contributions to your HSA, contributions to FSA, only for CSS profile, and then untaxed retirement distributions in Roth IRAs. So I wanted to say that this is one area that I work with families a lot on, because the reality is that I have worked with families that take from their Roth IRA to do home improvements because there's no penalty in certain cases, or families that might be planning on paying for college using their Roth IRA because there are no tax implications, but there are going to be implications for financial aid. There are other types like child support and alimony. Child support is not claimed on your taxes. If you're a single parent, you have to report the child support you've received and alimony you received if it's non-tax alimony. If you happen to be living, you know, a situation where you might be getting housing from your work, all of those allowances need to be counted. There are certain rules around that. Disability benefits, foreign income. And here's another one that I like to call out is student money received to pay bills by relatives. So what do I mean by that? So these are the same requirements whether you're reporting parent income or student income. So when you're reporting student income, if student is receiving help from grandparents or what have you, that income needs to be reported. And this has implications for when the student is in college, because when they're in college, a lot of parents think, oh, I'm going to get a lot of help from grandparents, which you should rely on. But there are rules in terms of which years you should be relying on that so that you can avoid the financial aid penalty that I work with families to understand and to map out in a financial plan. And then one that's interesting that CSS profile requires is for parent money received or bills paid by other household members. So this is a situation where in non-traditional living situations, the partner's contributions to the income need to be reported or should be reported by the parent. Now, let's move to the asset sides of the equation. I know that was a lot of information. I'm sure there were a lot of surprises there, because this part, just going back one slide, is a little surprising that there's all this untaxed income that you need to account for, that you need to, you know, report in, and that it could increase your EFC and impact your eligibility for financial aid. Now, moving to the asset side of it, basically it's all savings and investments that are not in your retirement account. So anything you have in a qualified account or retirement account is considered protected and should not be available to pay for college because it's been reserved for retirement. However, pretty much everything else that's not in your retirement is considered available. Checking, savings, CDs, brokerage. Now, a couple other ones I like to call out are 529 and college savings plans. Now, of course, you might think, well, yeah, that makes sense. 529 plan is used to save for college, so it should be reported. But there are rules on how to report it, because if you have multiple children, depending on who owns the 529 plan, you may have to report the student's siblings' 529 plans as part of your assets. And these are all assets that are reported as a parent asset when we're talking about 529 plans. Now, trusts are another area that is important to know, that whoever's the beneficiary of the trust, even if they don't have access to the money, if that access isn't until sometime in the future, the value of the trust at that date, on that date of filing, need to be reported. So that's another complicated rule that's really important to get clear on. So those are the two trickiest ones, I feel. And there are ways to improve your financial aid eligibility by knowing those rules and making sure that you aren't over-reporting 529s or under-reporting, if that's the case. The other thing that could be a little tricky is the CSS profile. Any sibling's assets, if the sibling is under 19 years old and not in college, need to be reported. Another big shocker. So if brother or sister are on Robinhood working out some stuff with Bitcoin for brokerage, and they have a sizable amount, on the CSS profile, the siblings' assets do need to be reported as part of the family income. So again, I help families around that and how to work with those rules. Now, here are some additional assets that are reported that I don't have time to get into. I'm going to be doing a workshop just for business owners or property owners on how to maximize this and understand the rules. But basically, personal business assets may have to be reported on FAFSA or CSS profile, depending on the size of your business, depending on various rules. So each financial aid application has different rules regarding the reporting requirements. What's interesting is CSS profile. FAFSA will just, if you have to report your business asset, you have to report the equity value or the value of the business, which of course would be the value minus any collateral or debt you have on the business. CSS profile asks 17 questions about every business you may own, including some points here. So it's a pretty detailed accounting of your business or your businesses for CSS profile. And I help families work through what that accounting looks like. Now for second properties, investment properties, and real estate, again, both have to be reported on FAFSA and CSS profile as assets potentially available to contribute to college, like leveraging those assets. But again, the rules are a little complicated depending on how you own the property, if it's deeded to yourself or to another entity. So I work with families on that in a lot of detail. But those, just to give you an idea, those will be coming up as standard questions on both applications. Now, I did want to touch a minute on CSS profile's requirement for you to report your home equity. So when I talk about properties earlier, both FAFSA and CSS profile require you to report all properties, land, etc., that are not considered your primary home. FAFSA does not require you to report anything about your primary home, whereas CSS profile does. Now, what's interesting is you report that home equity value. Actually, you report multiple data points on your home, but each college uses that home equity differently. So is home equity counted or not? So some of the colleges that use CSS profile, I have some examples here, ignore. They say, okay, yeah, you report your home equity, we're not even gonna look at it. We exclude it from our calculations. Some, excuse me, some colleges will cap it at a multiple of your income. So that could be a possibility. And some colleges use your full home equity, which I know nowadays is a scary thought because of the growth of the market and the increase in home values. So I'm going to give you a quick example of this. So I've worked with a family that has about $750,000 in home equity. And the reason why is they did a great job and they paid their home off. But their income is only $110,000. So you can see here, based on that home equity and their income, how home equity is counted when it's capped at 1.2 times their income, so they only count 132,000 of that home equity, when it's capped at 2 times their income, or when they use their home equity. And importantly, you can see the difference in financial aid awards. Now, these are estimated awards using that price calculator, but they range from $56,000 in financial aid and drop all the way to $12,000. This is for the same family, the same financial information, but it depends on how the college approaches their use of home equity. And I actually have a robust database that tells me which colleges use home equity at different rates. And I work with families through that, just so they're aware of what is impacting their financial aid and their and ultimately, and how they might be adjusting their college list if it makes sense, or potentially appealing where it makes sense as well. So one of the things about the CSS profile as well that's a little tricky is they ask a lot of questions on getting to your ability to pay without asking, well, we'll get to the final question, but they'll say questions like, how much did your parents pay for your student's private school in senior year? They'll ask if you have local scholarships, so they get an idea of the extra money you might have outside of what you're reporting as income and assets. They'll explicitly ask you if you have employer benefits that have tuition reimbursement and how much those are. And they even ask you if relatives or others are planning to provide funding for college. So they get really kind of nosy in terms of really trying to understand other sources of income you might have. But I think the trickiest question they ask, and this is a little paraphrased, is they ask you to provide the best estimate of what parents plan to pay from income and assets for college expenses. And, from a little bit of taking a editorial view on this, I think that's a little unfair question because they've already asked you so many details about your financial life, and then they want to ask you, well, how much do you think you should pay or you can pay? And I work with families on how to answer this question because it's a little bit of a tricky question. You clearly, everybody wants to say zero, and that's not realistic. But working to understand your EFC and a couple other factors it will help in being able to answer this question in a smart way. The one positive thing about CSS profile, now there are several, but some positive thing. But one bright spot is that they actually have a section where you can talk about special circumstances that the financial aid office should take into account. I call it as an opportunity for pre-appeal. I talk a lot with families. I work with families individually on how to appeal financial aid awards. But this is an opportunity at the beginning of the application to really explain your special circumstances and advocate for yourself. And this is an opportunity where you should be pretty detailed on what those circumstances are. So you can see here, there's a wide list. Clearly, they've added the COVID pandemic and explanation if that's impacted you in terms of multiple dimensions. But there are things that people don't necessarily think about. They think about job loss, but what about exceptional medical expenses? If God forbid, a sibling has to go through a procedure, either this has gone through or will continue to go through in the next year, like how do you document that so that they understand that? Catastrophic events, elderly care expenses. Do you have parents now living with you, and it's a multi-generational household, and is there a dependency there? So this is the opportunity for families to talk a little bit about their circumstances and be able to advocate for themselves. I will tell you that FAFSA is a government document that there's no nuance to it. You enter the data like you would a database, and you submit that. So there's not this opportunity on FAFSA. However, I do work with families to pre-position themselves with financial aid departments and let them know where they have circumstances that aren't captured in FAFSA. So that's important to know as well. So what are we talking about when we think about the CSS profile? So I take this headline, I didn't make this up. This is actually from the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a pretty major publication in higher ed. And they published this last year because there was a lot of pushback against, the Common App and the requirements now around this and that. And what they really called out is probably the most onerous form in college admissions is actually the CSS profile, because of the fact that they ask that many more questions about your financial life. As you can see here, there's approximately 270, not more questions, depending on it opens up menus depending on your answers, versus about 100 on FAFSA. And as you can see, you get a little sampling of CSS profile. I wasn't able to go through all of them. Ask next level detail on every financial category. So one of the things you could actually do if you wanted to get a preview of the CSS profile is you can use your child's College Board. If you have a CSS profile school, use your child's College Board login and hit apply for 2021-22 year, because there's, I have an application that's always open because I always need to be doing research on it. And you could just click through the questions and start to see the kind of questions they ask and the level of data they require. When I work individually with families, I have a worksheet that has all this information prepared. But nonetheless, you can get this information if you click into this year's current CSS profile. Again, do not apply using that. The 2022-23 application will not open until October 1st. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some opportunities to potentially work together. And I think the main reason why it could be smart to work with college financial planners is the process and the rules are pretty complex. And I can bring a deep knowledge of formulas and calculations and provide you personalized recommendations, as well as handle complexities of multiple children, each with their own unique needs. And I do a lot of proactive management of timelines, accuracy, and really helping families through the process. And depending on the type of engagement, work all the way through to award letters and appeals, helping them compare their award letters and understanding opportunities to appeal. However, advising plans I have for senior families, I do have a plan that's called Application Success Services. And there is a discount for AcceptU families. If you want to purchase this plan before October 1st, it's $100 off the plan. Each of these, whether you're a FAFSA only or FAFSA and CSS profile, you'll be able to see on my website, if you go to collegemoneymethod.com and click on New for Seniors, you'll see a description of all the steps that we take together and the number of meetings we have there. It involves 3 meetings, and it's really about making sure that you're getting the maximum financial aid by understanding what you need to report, what you don't need to report, as well as making sure that you're thinking about all of the nuances of the application. So that's an opportunity. I also offer, and I've worked with numerous AcceptU families, on more premium services where it's about creating a 4-year plan to pay for college and support all the way through appeals process, and that has a varying cost structure to it. But these are some opportunities. As well, I had mentioned I'm going to be doing a series of live and hands-on workshops, and I really like my workshops to focus on needs. So you've gotten an overview of the process, but I know there are particular needs for different family types. So I'll be offering one just on those families that need to submit the CSS profile and do it successfully, talking about some of the hardest sections of the CSS profile, what they're getting at, how you should be answering those questions is important. Then, of course, as I mentioned, for single or divorced parents, the rules are different than for married parents. And so I'll be having multiple workshops on how to navigate that successfully. And then finally, focus on business and property owners. What are the rules on when you do and do not have to report your businesses, how to report your businesses, and how to do that value? So all the workshops are about an hour. They're not necessarily just presentational. I take a lot of questions during them, and I'm even adding an extra 30 minutes onto the end for Q&A only. And I'm limiting these to small groups so that people get their questions answered. I put them in October as well. So, potentially you've already looked at the application, you know what kind of questions you're gonna have to come forward with. So, couple tips you can take away to prepare for the process, because you don't necessarily need to work with me. One of the things you can do is go ahead and calculate your EFC at collegeboard.com. So again, that's freely available service. So you get an idea of the expected family contribution and what the formulas say you should be ability to pay. So you get an idea, are you need, are you merit? And then you could start making decisions about applications and doing the research at a college level on what application you need to fill out depending on your type. Again, you want to catalog all of the colleges that are FAFSA only and then FAFSA and CSS profile, and really be clear about the due dates, because missing the due dates it could be, obviously you lose out on financial aid opportunities. Go ahead and create your logins. You don't have to wait till October 1st to create your FSA ID. If you don't happen to have a College Board ID, you can do that as well, a College Board login. You can do that today. In fact, I would do it a few days before you're planning to apply, because sometimes it takes 2 to 3 days for our government to process your account. One thing to be clear, in order to create an FSA ID, you only need a social security number and an email address. But when they process, it's just the government taking some time. There's only a few other questions beyond that in terms of your where you live, et cetera. So they don't collect a lot of information on you. It's really creating an account. You want to gather all your financial information early, because as you can see, there's a lot of information that may need to be reported. And in that process, you want to make sure you have it ready. You want to have the documents ready. You can use some of the things I've talked about or work with me to analyze your assets for any optimizations. There are opportunities potentially to boost your financial aid eligibility. And then give yourself extra time to get it right. What I mean by that is, these applications you can save and come back to. I think a lot of families try to power through, especially the CSS profile, and the questions start to become overwhelming, et cetera. If you're getting stuck in an area, you could save your application and come back to it. Maybe do some research online if you're working on your own to make sure you're answering questions correctly, because it's really important that you get it right. Because one thing I can tell you is that I have worked with families who submitted the application, had a couple errors, and once your application is pushed to all these financial aid offices, if you have corrections, you have to actually contact every financial aid office to submit your corrections. You're no longer able to correct them at the single application point. So it's important to give yourself that extra time to make sure the application is right before you push send. And therefore you could be assured that you've done that, you're done. And importantly, I should have put breathe between every one of these steps, because in every step of the way, this is invariably most families' first time through it. It's a lot of information to process. It's a lot of information to submit, but I know that you can be successful at it if you take your time and go through the right steps. So if anybody wants to contact me, here's my contact information. It's on my website, of course. Happy to take questions about some of the things that I brought up, if there are questions.
Yeah. Paul, we have lots of questions. I don't think you can see the Q&A chat box. So
pick some for me, please.
Yeah. So we can't probably get through all of the questions, but we can get through a lot in the next 10 to 15 or so minutes. As I said, we wanted to be mindful of everyone's time. So I think 10 minutes is a lot of time for us to cover one of the questions.
About the questions. So, the questions will keep piling up, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so one of the questions was, and some of these questions were asked probably before you presented the material. So you might say, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's good for reinforcement of material. So someone asked, how can families determine how their financial aid will change with multiple children enrolled in college simultaneously?
That's a really good question. Again, I covered that in a previous workshop with AcceptU, but essentially, as a rough rule, your EFC is determined at a family level with a little bit of change because there's a student component, but the bulk of it's coming from the parents. That EFC is divided equally by the number of students in college if it's a FAFSA school. So as a simple example, if your EFC is $50,000 and you have 2 kids in college, you're not expected to contribute $50,000 for one kid and $50,000 for the other. The total family contribution is $50,000. Each child will be expected to pay about $25,000 each. CSS profile, the formula is a little more convoluted, but basically each child has to pay 60% of that total EFC, which I can't do the calculation off the top of my head, which is probably like about $30,000 per kid as opposed to 25.
Great. Someone asked or stated, We are guardians slash grandparents of our granddaughter who is a high school senior. And what forms are we required to complete for finance or financial aid, or does our granddaughter file as an independent, with or without the guardian's information?
That's a great question. Yeah, so guardianship it depends on how the legal documents are written to be direct. So I need to like have a
Sure.